One day, while attending a corporate event organized by her company, Bank found herself in a world she had only ever seen on television. The venue was extravagant with marble floors, gold chandeliers, and elegantly dressed people mingling with glasses of champagne in their hands. Bank felt out of place at first, like a small fish in a vast ocean, but she put on her best smile, determined to make a good impression. It was there that she was amazed by the clinking of glasses and soft jazz music that she met Charles. Charles was unlike any man Bank had ever known. He was tall with a well-built frame and carried himself with an effortless confidence wherever he went, and dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He exhibited an air of elegance and power that was impossible to ignore. When his eyes landed on Bank, he paused his gaze, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. He walked over, a charming smile on his lips as he extended his hand. "You must be new here," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "I haven't seen you at any of these events before." Bank blushed as she shook his hand, her mind racing to find the right words. "Yes, sir, I'm Bank, and I just started a few months ago." "Ah, Bank is a beautiful name for a beautiful woman," he replied, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I am Charles." Over the course of the evening, Charles stayed by her side, asking her about her life, her dreams, and her aspirations. He seemed genuinely interested in her story, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke about her humble beginnings and her mother's sacrifices. Bank was captivated by the way he made her feel seen and valued. She couldn't believe that a man as powerful and wealthy as Charles would take an interest in someone like her. From that night on, Charles became a constant presence in Bank's life. He would send her flowers at work, take her to the most exclusive restaurant, and surprise her with thoughtful gifts that made her feel like a princess. He treated her with a kindness and generosity that she had never known before, making her feel as though she were the center of his world. But Charles's influence extended beyond romantic gestures. He went out of his way to open doors for Bank, using his connections to help her secure a position in an oil servicing company, one of the most prestigious in the city. It was an opportunity she could have only dreamed of, a job that would elevate her status and give her the financial stability she had always longed for. Bank's life transformed almost overnight. She went from living a modest existence to enjoying luxuries she had never imagined. Her new job came with a handsome salary, allowing her to buy new clothes, dining at high-end restaurants, and indulge in the finer things in life. She moved into a beautiful apartment in a well-to-do neighborhood far from the cramped room she had shared with her mother. For the first time in her life, Bank felt like she belonged among the wealthy elite of Lagos. Yet amidst all the glitz and glamour, a part of Bank felt conflicted. She had always dreamed of lifting herself and her mother out of poverty, and giving Mama Bank the comfortable life she deserved, but as she settled into her new world, she found herself growing more distant from her humble root. She still sent money to her mother, but her visits became infrequent. Her calls shorter. It was as if the world she once knew was slowly fading away and replaced by a new shining reality. After a few months of dating, Charles proposed. He took her to a secluded beach as he knelt down and presented her with a diamond ring that sparkled like 1,000 stars. Tears fell Banker's eyes as she looked down at him, her heart pounding with excitement and disbelief. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You are everything I've ever wanted. Marry me, and I promise I will make you the happiest woman in the world." Bank didn't hesitate. She said yes. Her voice choked with emotion as she threw her arms around him. In that moment, she felt as though she were living in a fairy tale, as if all the struggles and hardships of her past had been erased and replaced by a future filled with love, wealth, and security. The wedding was a grand affair attended by the city's elite and held in one of the most luxurious venues in Lagos. Mama Bank arrived in her best dress, her heart swelling with pride and joy as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. She marveled at the life her daughter had found, thanking God for blessing her child with a man as kind and generous as Charles. After the ceremony, Mama Bank took Bank's hands in hers, her eyes shining with tears. "My daughter, my precious girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you. You've made me the happiest mother in the world." Bank smiled, squeezing her mother's hand. "Mama, I owe it all to you. Without you, I would never have made it here. Thank you for everything." In that moment, Bank meant every word. She truly believed that she would always be grateful, always remember her mother's sacrifices. But as she settled into her new life with Charles, she became accustomed to the luxuries and privileges that came with being a wealthy man's wife. Her perspective began to shift. She started to see her old life and her mother's struggles as something distant, something she had left behind. For Mama Bank, however, the joy of seeing her daughter's success was tempered by a quiet worry. She couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was drifting away, that the life of wealth and luxury was suddenly erasing the bond they had once shared, but she told herself that it was just her imagination, that Bank was simply adjusting to her new life. Little did she know this new life would bring changes she could never have anticipated. The month following her marriage to Charles was like a dream. She moved into Shorrell's mansion, a grand estate that sprouted across acres of land complete with manicured gardens, marble floors, and rooms that looked as if they had been lifted from the pages of a luxury magazine. Every morning she woke to the gentle hum of air conditioning, the scent of fresh flowers, and the comfort of Egyptian cotton sheets. She was no longer the girl from a cramped one-room apartment. She was now Mrs. Bank Charles, a woman of stature and wealth. In her new life, she found herself surrounded by people who lived for luxury. Her social circle consisted of society women who measured worth by the label on their clothes, the brands of their jewelry, and the size of their homes. Conversations at once were filled with talks about designer brands, vacation homes, and the latest trends. The simplicity of her past began to feel foreign. A part of her didn't fit into this polished, glittering world, but still one thing lingered in her mind: her mother, Mama Bank, who had sacrificed so much to give her this opportunity. She felt a pull, a quiet obligation, and in a moment of clarity, she decided to invite her mother to come live with her. One cold evening, Bank made the call. "Mama, it is me." Bank said, "Ah, my daughter, how are you?" Mama Bank's voice was filled with joy, as though the simple act of hearing her daughter's voice had lifted the weight of years from her shoulders. "I'm good, Mama, very good. I want you to come live with me and Charles. It is time you get a taste of the life you helped me achieve." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Mama Bank's voice came through. "You mean it? You want me to come live with you?" Bank smiled even though her mother couldn't see it. "Of course, Mama, you deserve to rest, to enjoy the life you helped me build." Mama Bank's heart swelled with joy. She packed her belongings with trembling hands, carefully folding her best clothes and placing them in a worn-out suitcase. She paused to look at the room she had called home for so many years, a space filled with memories of long nights spent praying for her daughter's success and sacrifices made without regret. She whispered a prayer of gratitude before stepping outside, ready to begin a new chapter in her life. The day she arrived at Bank Mansion was one of the happiest days of her life. She marveled at the towering gates, the LOD gardens, and the grandeur of the house. It was like something out of a dream, a world she had never thought she would be a part of. Bank greeted her at the door dressed in a check dress, looking every bit like the wealthy woman she had become. Mama Bank's eyes shone with pride as she looked at her daughter. A smile lightened up her face. "Ah, Bank, look at you. You are so beautiful, and this house is like heaven on earth," Mama Bank said. Bank smiled. "Yes, Mama, it is a good life. Come, let me show you where you'll be staying." Mama Bank followed her daughter through the house, her heart pounding with excitement. She imagined herself sitting in a beautiful room, perhaps with a view of the garden, a place where she could finally rest without worry. But as they walked past the grand living room through the dining hall and into the backyard, excitement began to fade. Bank led her to a small building at the far end of the property, a modest structure that seemed out of place amidst the luxury of the mansion. She opened the door, revealing a small, beautifully furnished room with a bed, a chair, and a small table. "This is where you will stay, Mama," Bank said, her tone neutral. Mama Bank looked around, her smile fading. She tried to hide her disappointment, telling herself that this was better than her old home and that she was lucky to be here at all. But a small part of her couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. "Thank you, Bank," she said quietly, forcing a smile. "It is lovely." Bank nodded. Her expression was unreadable. "Make yourself comfortable, and please don't wander into the main house unless you have a reason to be there. Charles likes his privacy, and I don't want him to feel uncomfortable." The words stung each other like a tiny pain pricking in Mama Bank's heart. She nodded. "I understand, my daughter. I understand." At first, Mama Bank tried to adjust to her new life, telling herself that she was grateful to be near her daughter even if it meant staying out of sight. She cleaned her small room, arranged her few belongings, and spent her days exploring the garden or sitting in quiet solitude. She was careful to stay out of the main house, mindful of her daughter's words, though she longed to feel a part of her daughter's world. But it didn't take long for Bank's demand to shift. She began to treat her mother not as a guest but as a servant. She would summon her to clean the house, to scrub the floors until they shone, to cook meals for her and Charles. Each time Mama Bank complied without complaint, telling herself that this was a small price to pay to be close to her daughter. One afternoon Bank had some friends over. The house was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses as they enjoyed a lavish spread of food and drinks. Bank called her mother into the kitchen. Her tone was sharp. "Mama, the guests are here, I need you to make sure everything is perfect," she said, her eyes cold and commanding. Her mother nodded, setting to work in silence. She could hear the laughter of the guest from the dining room, the joy and friendship that felt so foreign to her now. As she scrubbed the kitchen counters and arranged the dishes, a feeling of sadness washed over her. She had always dreamed of seeing her daughter surrounded by friends and happiness, but she had never imagined it would be at the cost of her own dignity. As she carried a tray of drinks into the dining room, one of Bank's friends looked at her, a hint of confusion in her gaze. "Bank, is this your mother?" the lady asked, her tone surprised. Bank's face changed for a brief moment before she regained her composure. She laughed. "Oh yes, that's my mother. She insists on helping around the house, can't get her to relax." "You know?" The words felt like a slap to her, but she forced herself to smile, nodding in agreement. "Yes, I like to stay busy," she mummed. Her voice barely audible as the guest left Bank's mansion. She changed again. She turned to her mother, her expression hardening as she ordered her to clean up the mess, to scrub every corner until it sparkled. Mama Bank complied without a word, but as she worked, she felt a bitterness she had never known before. Each night as she lay alone in her small room, Mama Bank would think back to the life she had left behind. She thought of the warmth and familiarity of her old neighborhood, the kindness of neighbors who had become like her family. Here she felt like a stranger, a servant in her own daughter's home. Days turned into weeks, and Mama Bank's hope of a warm life with her daughter dimmed with each passing day. The bond they once shared felt like a distant memory replaced by a strained connection that left Mama Bank feeling more alone than ever. She told herself that this was just an adjustment period, that Bank was simply adapting to her new life, but deep down, a nagging doubt crept into her heart, whispering that perhaps her daughter had changed in ways she could never have anticipated. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Mama Bank sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling with fatigue. She had spent hours scrubbing the floors, cooking a 3-square meal for Bank and Charles, and polishing the windows until they gleamed. Her back ached, her hands were sore, and her spirit felt crushed under the weight of it all. She looked around the tiny room, her heart sinking as she looked at the bare walls. The small, uncomfortable single window that offered a view of the tall fence surrounding the estate. It was a far cry from the life she had dreamed of. She had imagined herself in a big room within the main house, perhaps near her daughter, where they could share quiet moments and reminisce about their journey, but instead, she was relegated to the outskirt, hidden away like an afterthought. As she sat in the silence, memories flooded her mind. Memories of long nights spent praying for Bank's success, of mornings spent frying a kara in the rain, of the sacrifices she had made without hesitation. She remembered the promises Bank had made, the words that had once filled her with hope. "Mama, I will make you proud again. I will take care of you. You never have to work again." Mama Bank clenched her fist, a wave of anger and hurt washing over her. She had given everything to her daughter's heart and soul into raising her, only to be treated like a stranger in her own child's home. The pain was almost too much to bear, and for the first time she allowed herself to question the choices she had made. "What happened to my little girl?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking with emotion. The following morning, she decided to confront Bank, hoping to understand the change in her daughter's behavior. She found Bank in the living room, ringing through her phone with an air of detachment, as though the world beyond the screen held no interest for her. "Mama, what is it?" "I'm busy," Bank said, barely looking at her mother. Mama Bank took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I need to talk to you. I feel like I don't recognize you anymore. You've become someone I don't know, someone who treats her own mother like a stranger." Bank's eyes narrowed. "Mama, what are you talking about? I gave you a place to stay, didn't I? I fed you. I clothed you. Isn't that enough? It is not about the food or the clothes." Mama Bank replied, her voice filled with desperation. "It is about the way you treat me and the way you speak to me. I am not a stranger, Bank. I'm your mother." Bank's expression hardened. "Mama, you don't understand, this is my life now. I worked hard to get here to be respected, and I can't have you ruining that. People expect a certain image and you don't fit into that." The words cut deep, leaving Mama Bank speechless. She looked at her daughter, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her chest tightened, and tears filled her eyes as she struggled to hold back the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. "I don't fit into your life," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "After everything I did for you, after all the sacrifices I made, you are ashamed of me." Bank sighs, rolling her eyes. "Mama, it is not about being ashamed. It's about understanding that things are different now. I'm not that little girl anymore. I have responsibilities and expectations to meet." Mama Bank felt her heart shatter. She looked at her daughter, at the girl who was once her pride and joy, and realized she was no longer the girl she had raised. This was someone else, a stranger who wore her daughter's face but carried none of the love and warmth that Bank once held. Without another word, Mama Bank turned and walked back to her room. Her steps slow and heavy, she closed the door behind her and sat down on the bed, the tears finally spilling over. She cried for the daughter she had lost, for the dreams that had crumbled before her eyes, and for the love that had been replaced by coldness and indifference. The days that followed was filled with an unbearable tension. Bank continued to treat her mother with disdain, ordering her around the house, making her clean, cook and serve as though she were a hired maid. Mama Bank bore it all in silence, her spirit breaking a little more each day. She no longer felt like a mother, but rather like a burden, an inconvenience that Bank tolerated out of duty rather than love. One evening, as Mama Bank was washing dishes in the kitchen, Charles entered. He watched her for a moment. He could see her weary expression and the sadness in her eyes. He had noticed the change in Bank behavior, the way she treated her mother as though she were beneath her, and it troubled him. "Mama, please sit down and let me help," he said, reaching for a dish. Mama Bank looked up surprised. "Charles, I'm fine. This is my work." Charles shook his head, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mama, you are not a servant here. You are family." The words were like a lump on Mama Bank's throat, and she blinked back tears as she looked at Charles, her heart aching with gratitude. He was kind and compassionate, and he had always treated her with respect. She wanted to tell him everything, to pour out the pain and heartbreak she had been carrying, but fear held her back. She didn't want to create problems for her daughter. She didn't want to be the cause of discord in her new life. She said quietly, "You are very kind." Charles nodded, his gaze filled with concern. He glanced towards the living room where Bank was lounging on the sofa, her eyes fixed on her phone. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for her behavior, but he held back, unsure of how to approach the situation. As days went on, Charles continued to watch the interactions between Bank and her mother, his discomfort growing with each passing day. He couldn't understand why Bank, a woman who had once been so full of love and kindness, would treat her own mother with such callousness. He sensed that something was deeply wrong, but each time he tried to bring up the subject with Bank, she brushed him off, dismissing his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Charles, Mama is fine," she would say, her tone laced with irritation. "She's just adjusting. She likes to keep busy, and you know that." But Charles wasn't convinced. He could see the sadness in Mama Bank's eyes. He wanted to help, but he felt powerless, trapped between his loyalty to his wife and his compassion for his mother-in-law. Mama Bank continued to suffer in silence, her heart breaking a little more each day, while Charles watched from the sidelines, struggling to understand the darkness that had taken root in the woman he loved. Days turned into weeks, and Mama Bank's quiet suffering became part of her daily existence. She moved through the house like a ghost, silently tending to the endless chores her daughter assigned to her, all while hiding the growing sorrow in her heart. Yet despite the pain, she still held on to a faint hope, a hope that her daughter would one day remember the bond they had shared, that she would see beyond her new life and recognize the love and sacrifice that had brought her here. One evening, Bank's voice echoed through the house, calling her mother into the main mansion. "Mama," she shouted, her tone sharp. Mama Bank rushed into the house, her heart pounding. She hadn't been allowed into the main house for days, only entering when it was time to clean, with Bank watching her every move like a hawk. As she stepped into the house, she looked around, her eyes widening in surprise. Bank stood by the staircase, her arms crossed. "Mama, I have decided it is time for you to stay in the main house," she said, pointing towards one of the guest rooms. "This will be your room for now." Mama Bank's heart leaped for joy. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter. "Bank, my daughter, thank you. I don't know what to say." Bank smiled for a brief moment. Mama Bank saw a flash of the girl she had once known, the daughter who had promised to make her proud, to repay her sacrifices. Her heart swelled with gratitude, and she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where she could finally share in her daughter's life, not as a servant but as family. Bank led her to the guest room, a spacious, elegant room with a large bed, a beautiful curtain, and a view of the garden. It was a stark contrast to the cramped quarters she had been confined to, and Mama Bank couldn't hold back her tears of joy. "Thank you, Bank," she whispered. "I am so grateful." Bank nodded. "You are welcome, Mama. I want you to be comfortable here." For the first time in months, she felt a sense of belonging. She was given a warm meal, allowed to sit at the dining table, and treated with kindness and respect. She even had a short conversation with Bank for the first time in a long while, and although it was brief, it filled her heart with a renewed sense of hope. The next morning, Mama Bank was still basking in the happiness of her newfound place in the family. She carefully dressed in one of the new clothes Bank had given her, a beautiful trending outfit that made her feel young and vibrant. She spent the morning exploring the house, marveling at the beautiful decor, the luxurious fish, and the quiet elegance that surrounded her. As she wandered through the halls, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. She looked out the window and saw a woman stepping out of a sleek black car. Her posture was elegant and dignified. It was Charles' mother, a woman known for her refined manners and designing eye. Mama Bank felt a flicker of excitement mixed with nervousness. She had met Charles' mom only once before at the wedding. Mama Charles entered the house, her gaze sweeping over the grand entrance before settling on Bank, who had come to greet her with a wide, welcoming smile. Mama Bank watched from a distance, feeling a pang of pride as she saw her daughter acting the perfect hostess, gracious and charming in every way. She watched as Bank led her mother-in-law into the living room, serving her tea with a grace that did not represent her humble beginnings. "Mom-in-law, it's wonderful to have you here," Bank said, her voice warm and filled with admiration. "Please make yourself at home, Mama." Charles smiled, nodding approvingly. "Thank you, Bank. You've done well. It is good to see you settled." The two women chatted with Bank. Showering her mother-in-law with attention and compliment, she spoke of her love for Charles, her dedication to the family, and the importance of maintaining a harmonious household. Mama Bank listened from afar, a small smile on her lips as she watched her daughter put on a perfect display of warmth and poise. Later that evening, as they gathered around the dining table, Bank invited her mom to join them. She even set a place for her mother beside her, something she had never done before. Mama Bank felt valued as she took her seat, feeling as though she were truly a part of the family. For the first time, she ate in silence, silently thanking God for this unexpected blessing. Throughout Mama Charles' visit, Bank maintained the facade of a loving, devoted daughter. She brought her mother into the main rooms, gave her fine clothes, and spoke to her with respect and affections. Mama Charles was washed with approval, nodding with satisfaction as she observed the bond between mother and daughter. But Mama Bank's joy was short-lived. The very night that Mama Charles left, Bank's demand, the warmth and kindness she had shown, vanished. "I do not know what you are still doing here," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "This was only temporary. You need to go back to the boys' quarters. This room isn't for you." Mama Bank felt her heart sink. The hope that had bloomed within her suddenly withered away. She looked at her daughter, her face covered with betrayal, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I thought things had changed. You inviting me here made me feel like a part of the family." Bank laughed. "Mama, please don't be dramatic. I only did it because Mama Charles was coming. She has a certain expectation, and I couldn't have you embarrassing me in front of her." The words hit Mama Bank like a physical blow. Her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She stared at her daughter, struggling to comprehend the coldness in her voice and the callousness in her actions. She had been nothing more than a prop, a tool to maintain appearances, and the realization caught her deeper than any wound. Bank's gaze was devoid of remorse. "Mama, please go back to your room. I have a reputation to maintain, and I can't have you interfering with that." Without another word, Mama Bank rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate as she walked back to the boys' quarters. Her hands trembled as she closed the door behind her, the weight of her heartbreak pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty walls, her mind numb with pain and disbelief. She had given everything to her daughter. Her love, her sacrifices, her life, and yet she had been cast aside, treated like a burden, a stain on her daughter's pristine image. The days following Mama Charles' departure were marked by an unbearable silence. Each morning Mama Bank rose early to turn to the house. She moved like a ghost, her body frail, her hands trembling as she scrubbed and cleaned, her mind numb with pain. As the days passed, her health began to deteriorate. She felt a persistent ache in her body, a deep fatigue that led her struggling to keep up with the endless task her daughter assigned her. Her hands were swollen, her back ached, and her vision blurred from time to time. She felt a fever creeping over her, leaving her drenched in sweat one moment and shivering the next. But even as her burden weakened her, Mama Bank continued her work, afraid to show any sign of weakness. She knew that Bank's patience with her was thin, and she didn't want to be a burden and didn't want to give her daughter any reason to turn her out completely. So she suffered in silence, pushing herself beyond her limits. One night her fever got worse. Mama Bank found herself lying on her bed. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Bank's number. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the ringtone. Finally, Bank's voice came through, cold and irritated. "Mama, it is late. What do you want?" "My daughter," she yanked, her voice weak. "I'm not feeling well. I think I have a fever. Can you come please?" Her tone filled with annoyance. "Mama, it is just a fever. Take some water. Get some rest. I'm trying to sleep, but bank, I can't. I can barely move, she whispered. Please. I just need. Bank cut her off, her voice sharp. Mama, please stop disturb me. You'll be fine. Don't call me again for something so trivial. The line went dead. The silence on the other end felt like an overwhelming sense of abandonment. She stared at the phone, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face as she realized the extent of her daughter's indifference. The pain was too much to bear, and her spirit was broken beyond repair. Mama Bank lifted her gaze to the ceiling. She whispered as she spoke the words that had been buried in her heart for so long. As you have treated me, so shall your children treat you. May you feel the pain you have given me. May you know the loneliness you have forced upon me. As you have done to me, so shall it be done to you. Mama Bank placed a curse on her daughter. She felt a strange sense of relief wash over her, a release of the pain that had been in her heart for so long. But even as she spoke, a part of her grieved. Mama Bank got reached for her phone once more. Her mind drifted to Charles, the one person who had shown her kindness and who had treated her with dignity and respect. Charles had traveled to a neighboring city for a business transaction. With her last ounce of strength, she dialed his number, praying he would answer the phone. The phone barely rang before Charles picked up, his voice filled with concern. Mama, is everything all right? Charles, she whispered, her voice faint and weak. Please, I need your help. I am very sick. Charles's voice was filled with concern as he replied, Hold on, Mama. I am sending an ambulance, just stay with me, okay? Help is on the way. Within minutes the sound of sirens filled the night air. Bank, startled by the noise, rushed to the window. Her eyes widened as she saw the ambulance pulling into the driveway. Confusion and fear gripped her as she saw the paramedics rush towards the boys' quarters. She hurried downstairs, her heart racing as she stepped outside only to see her mother being carried on a stretcher, her face pale, her body frail and trembling. For a moment a flicker of guilt crossed Bank's heart, but she quickly pushed it aside as she followed the pairings to the ambulance. As the ambulance doors closed, Bank climbed into her car, her mind racing as she followed the vehicle to the hospital. She sat in the waiting room, her gaze fixed on the floor as she waited for the news of her mother's condition. The minutes stretched into hours, when Charles arrived the next morning. His face was filled with worry. He walked over to Bank, his voice filled with concern. How is she? Bank looked away, unable to meet his gaze. They are still running some tests, so I don't know yet. Charles nodded and took a seat beside her. He looked at her, his eyes searching as though he could sense the guilt that lay beneath her calm facade. After a few days in the hospital, Mama Bank was finally discharged, but her heart had changed. She refused to return to Bank's house. I cannot go back to that house, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. I would rather return to the life I knew, the life that gave me peace. Charles nodded with understanding. He offered his support. He respected her decision, and so Mama Bank returned to the slum where she had lived for so many years, her heart heavy but free from the burdens that had weighed her down. She had given everything, sacrificed all she had, and in the end she had found peace in letting go. But there is something about the curse of a mother. It never fails. Many years later something strange began to happen to Bank. Watch out for part 2. If you enjoyed the story, then I am certain that you enjoy the next story showing on the screen right now. Please click on the thumbnail and watch the next story. Please support me by liking this video, sharing it with your family and friends, and subscribing to my channel. See you in my next story. Bye.